All right. Well, thanks for coming down, Luke.
Absolute pleasure.
I guess we've been working together now for 4 years.
Yeah, give or take.
Yeah. So since May 2014.
Wow. There you go. So we obviously know a lot of your story and and I guess more so around IndigenousX. But yeah, if you want to just give us a brief little intro on yourself as an individual outside of IndigenousX, because your profile is so
Yeah, I was
tied
going
to
to say, I don't know
IndigenousX.
that I even exist outside of IndigenousX anymore. But yeah, so I'm Luke Pearson, Gamilla Royfalla. Was born in Sydney, grew up in Wagga, moved up to Newcastle, Sydney, Central Coast, Newcastle, Sydney, Central Coast. So sort of yo-yoing back and forth, as many of us do.
Yeah.
Currently working at the ABC, but before that NITV, before that IDX.
Yes.
Before that, a primary teacher, which is very detached from the space I now find myself in.
Totally.
And that whole time, juggling IndigenousX, work, family, everything else.
Yeah. So, from being a teacher, you've really basically positioned yourself as somebody in the media or as a media personality as well. What was that transition like? Was that always the vision to end up in media, or was it just a byproduct of getting on Twitter so early and being involved?
Yeah, well, I think, for those of us who were around when I started on Twitter, just as myself, like long before IndigenousX was about, there were no examples of anyone making careers or transitions into media or anything from Twitter. So, it was sort of post-teaching. I taught at university for a little bit, then was basically just wandering around, doing a bit of consulting, a bit of training, a bit of work with schools and running programs with young kids in high schools and other spaces. And Twitter was just fun. It was just really unloading, saying things that I thought needed to be said.
Yeah.
And then really quickly it sort of amassed a small community of key Indigenous people who are also pretty vocal, and non-Indigenous people who are interested in learning more.
Yeah.
That led to IndigenousX, and 6 years later, running a media organisation and a media person. I still don't know that I'd call myself a journalist, but certainly opinionated and some of the things to say. But it's been great working at NITV and ABC to actually learn some more traditional media skills and bring that to just having an opinion on things, which more and more there's no shortage of people with opinions. It's nice to actually have some skills and expertise to underpin how you tell that story and not just content knowledge.
Yeah, totally.
How's with the movement between locations but then also careers as well, how's that influenced you with IndigenousX and all the things that you do today?
Yeah, well, I think being really adaptive and able to go with the flow and respond quickly to things as they happen. So like I've now got a little girl and 2 boys as well, and did not see any of that coming. And so there's IndigenousX has been great in how flexible it is and how there is a really strong community of supporters around it who will help pick up the slack when I get too busy or coming at me with ideas. And so there have been times where it's really run on absolute minimal, and we just kept it going. It's with the hosted account particularly, Thursday to Thursday, 7 p.m, the show must go on sort of philosophy. And in those busy times it really was, ringing someone up at 7:05. Can you please start right now? To now, and we've actually got some people on board. Jack Lattimore, who's been on board for over a year now, has been a great support, and on average we're 6 weeks to 3 months booked out in advance. So
really,
takes
that's
a
huge.
lot of pressure off.
Definitely.
And helps you be a bit more structured and think about what weeks are coming up, who's a good person for a given week.
Yeah. And are you curating as much as you used to, or is it more like when people have something that's coming up, they literally contact IndigenousX and see if they could host, or if you're willing to partner or anything along those lines? Is it a bit more?
In the early days it was very much me driving it 100%, and persuading and coercing people to come on and give a week, and no one really knew what it was. So there are, again, that core group of people who are really excited and who believed in it and who would always be there for those last minute backup weeks. But reaching out to other people, back then you had to explain what Twitter was, what IndigenousX was, what was involved. Whereas now, so many people have heard of it. When we do ask people, most people are really responsive, and more people are getting in touch. And some of the people who would have got in touch like 4 or 5 years ago are now going, oh, it's Wednesday, can I host tomorrow? No, doesn't work that way anymore.
And where you envisage it going, IndigenousX, has it progressed to the point where you want it to go to? Has it tracked along the way that you want it to go?
Well, again, because the start was just so spontaneous and it was all just a passion with no background in business or in media, it was very hard to envisage what that future could potentially look like. Whereas what it's grown into, I think things I never would have imagined. I never really envisaged it being anything more than the Twitter account, and then having our sister account in Canada, just for a start, is something like never even dreamt of that possibility and just stumbled across it. Much the same with the website. Like I used to run a personal blog, and occasionally I'd get a guest blogger to come in, and now with your guys' support, actually having our own website, and we're looking at we are pretty close to capacity to having at least an article a day, if not multiple a day. I think certainly by the end of the year.
Fantastic.
Branching out into video content, branching out into audio content, events, consultancy, it's above and beyond anything that I ever imagined.
Awesome.
And just really hope I'm up to the task of doing the best we can with it.
So far, so good.
Yeah.
It's actually interesting hearing about, I guess, a little bit of the origin and the fact that you had to explain to potential hosts, what Twitter is, the whole 140 character vibe. Now you've got 280 characters to work in.
Yep.
You've seen a lot of the changes. I think it's been a decade or more. I'm interested to hear some of your insights into what you see as the change that's happened from the perspective of a user, but somebody who is using these platforms, and how it's, I guess, changed, but also the impact that you're sort of seeing from platforms like Twitter and I guess the other big social platform that is Facebook and now Instagram and the like.
Yeah, well, I mean, there are so many positives and negatives and huge question marks that you look at, and I think in the early days of social media there really was a big emphasis on the negatives in the media, and whether that was part because media saw it as a potential risk to them, so they tried to downplay it, but particularly with Indigenous social media in the early days, all you would hear about was Facebook bullying stories or potential risk to your career. There was no one saying you can actually potentially build a career through these platforms.
Totally.
But I think it's still, even though, like I said, I've been there probably close to 10 years as an individual, IndigenousX right on the cusp of 6 years, there's still not a lot out there that lets people know how to do that. And so it's been really good working with different individuals and organisations about you don't just turn up with an idea and say, here it is, give me $1 million sort of, it's, and we've seen a few people who have just burn out in 6 weeks thinking they had something that would, like IndigenousX came after I'd been personally on there for about 3 years. Had already built that community, already had people respecting me as an individual, and then really slowly explaining the philosophy of what we were doing, and making mistakes and being able to come back from that, and being able to adapt with those changes. And so I really look forward to that next generation when there will be people, and I mean, technology generation, not actual generation, generation like 6 months turnover. But when people will be able to look at things like IndigenousX, like what you guys are doing, and just say, okay, I can learn from those who come before us, because coming into Indigenous media without having a media background, I didn't know a lot or how long that history was. Having studied at uni and things, I knew about the Abo call from 1938.
Right.
But there's a lot of things that people have been doing in the in-between, and even before that as well, that I really was unaware of. And so in the early days, I made that mistake of we're doing something brand new and no one's done anything like this before. And, it was new because of the platform, but in terms of Indigenous people being in control of their own stories in media, there was nothing new about that at all.
Yeah, totally.
And so I've been lucky that I've been able to interact more and more with a lot of those, founders and pioneers, and learn some of that history, help them tell those stories, help people fill in those gaps, and grow from that. And so, whatever comes next, I hope really comes with the benefit of our learnings and our mistakes.
Definitely.
So how did you, I guess you look at your journey from, where you began, as you were saying, it was very much you on Twitter, out there reaching out, engaging, and then you look at it to today, and basically you've got a host a week, you've got potentially multiple hosts a week, you've got multiple articles coming up per week. How did you get to that point where firstly you started to draw in, what did you do to draw in followers, and then what has the journey been to now have other people essentially say, when can I host, when can I do it, when can I participate?
I think a big part of it is that idea of, when we talk about Indigenous leadership and Aboriginal leadership, and how problematic a term that has become, largely because of media and what does that even mean? And I've always been a big fan of that idea that a good leader doesn't make more followers, they make more leaders. And so, rather than coming and saying, if you want to be IndigenousX, you have to do this my way. I've never been a person who sort of thinks that I have the answers or the right way. Like, I certainly have my answers for me and very strong opinions about what I do and why I do it. But having that philosophy across IndigenousX of really embracing the diversity of perspective and experience, that idea that everyone's got a story to tell, and what IndigenousX provides more than anything else is an engaged audience who want to hear your story. And so having that, maintaining that space as safe as is possible given the nature of a space like Twitter, but I would still say IndigenousX is remarkably safe and troll-free given the size and the prominence that it's developed. And so
the community does a lot of self-maintenance, though, right?
Yes,
I definitely noticed that.
In the early days there was a core group of us who very actively patrolled the space and kept it free, whereas now a lot of it just takes care of itself. And so I try to have minimal input from me personally to have to intervene on anything other than, if you see a host might be doing it tough, you might give them a call and how you go on and talk through with them whatever challenges they're facing. But otherwise, the community just self-polices, self-monitors and self-corrects as needed. But there's never been a shortage of people out there who are dying to tell their story and to raise awareness and to challenge the status quo. And so more than anything, it was having the visibility, having the trust with people that says, if you come to tell your story, it's your story. We're not going to alter that. We're not going to censor that. We're going to embrace that, and it's yours for the week. Once you are the host, you are IndigenousX. And once we got
that's
that
quite empowering as well.
Once people knew that would be the case, we haven't had many problems since.
Okay, it's an interesting aspect to how I guess a community grows, and in particular in this space, it has the ability to be quite inflammatory. Individuals. So that's some really interesting insight. I have a question for you around Twitter as a platform and the ebb and flow, I guess, in the general population of how Twitter has been perceived. It obviously kicked off with a massive boom and there was a lot of traction. Then it kind of really was under a lot of pressure from other social platforms. And, you've kept IndigenousX very, very strong on Twitter and haven't grown, I guess, the conversation as much through other platforms. Do you see, what are the pros and cons, I guess, that you see of keeping it strong in Twitter, but, I'd imagine there's a vision to obviously grow other platforms, go where the audience is so you can reach different markets and different demographics, have different conversations. But, what are, I guess, the pros and cons around Twitter itself and how it functions as a platform for what IndigenousX is?
Well, I think the nature of Twitter, with its real-time interactivity, the hashtags, the news, the influencers who are there make it ideal for something like the rotating hosts.
Yeah.
And again, our audience is really hungry to hear those stories, and they're there in real time. If you don't like a given host, you just don't pay attention that week. You come back next week. So it is really easy to come and go and interact at your leisure.
Yep.
Whereas a place like Facebook, the way that it rewards and punishes certain behaviours through their algorithms and access, makes something like a regular hosted account really impossible.
You'd have to spend a lot of money these days to keep your traffic up.
Yeah,
definitely.
That's it, and there'd have to be a lot of research. And if you host, you have to post at these times with these work, and that is really against the principles of what we say of like do what you want to do when you want to do it. Whatever time. If you want to be up at 2 a.m. tweeting, there's people who'll be awake listening. So Twitter's great for that sort of interaction. Where I think the other platforms will really be more for our own created content.
Yeah.
So video content, articles, posts, campaigns. So we do utilise those platforms, but again, time poor means not as much as we would like to. But we do have future plans and ideas for how we'll tap into those. But I think the core of IndigenousX, which will always be our hosting, will only ever be a Twitter space.
Yeah. So then what role then, I guess, has the website played then in, I guess, being side by side with your Twitter hosting page, but then also, I guess, why did you come to the decision as well to actually establish a website in the first place?
Well, I've always been a pretty prolific writer personally, just whether that would be just for my own sanity to put ideas down. It took me a long time before I started to share them on a blog. But people were really responsive to that, and I think the ability to provide content that people were interested in, but there wasn't a lot out there. And a lot of my early sort of focus for what sort of content to create was, if you can Google it and there's already really great stuff out there, well then either write something that points to that and builds on that, but look for those gaps of knowledge and those areas of interest for me personally that were lacking in that. And then other people would reach out and see other people, like Lisa Wadigo did such amazing work with her blog, which was Deadly Bloggers, which she would just curate all the different blogs out there, and it made me realise that there is a talent pool out there, there is an interest in that. And that was what made the IndigenousX website become really relevant. I think when we talk about the real-time nature of Twitter, like a great tweet might do the rounds for a few days, maybe even a week, and bounce back. Like if you put up a January 26th tweet 3 years ago, you'll see it get retweeted next Invasion Day. But other than that, they're lost in the ether, and you don't go and read that far back in someone's timelines. But an article sits there, it's accessible, it's searchable, and it becomes that artifact that teachers are using in their classrooms, people are using it with their kids, people are using it for their own learning, and with that education background, being able to provide more depth than you can in 140 now to 180 characters was a natural step.
Definitely. I mean, we see the data, like when we're looking through the analytics, there are certain posts that all year round do well, and you can basically, they guarantee you X amount of traffic all year just from Google searches, because of, like you said, it's there, it's an archived place, and people can come back. I think that's really, really valuable overall, and I like that idea that you sort of alluded to there. It's not just about regurgitating or filling the space with singular topics. What are the gaps? What do people want to actually talk about, and what opportunities are there to basically put content out there and raise more awareness and provide more of, talking points for everybody? Because it's not just about our community, it's the whole general population have an opportunity to interact and learn. It's great.
And to talk outside of the norms as well is really important. Like I'm really interested in getting more content that is from Indigenous people, but isn't, like I think a lot of the time, and I'm certainly guilty of this, we fall into that space of filling those gaps of non-Indigenous ignorance. And
Yes.
that is really important, and I'm really happy when I get a message from someone saying, I get asked this all the time, and I used to have to spend hours trying to explain this to people. Now I just send them your link. So I was like, if I can save hundreds of hours of emotional labour for other Indigenous people answering those really annoying questions, then that is important. And I have an interest in that space, and the thinking that underpins racism and ignorance and the philosophies of it, coming from a education perspective, but also a history buff perspective. I love to spend time in that space, but also socially, like, we all get very exhausted by it.
Very much so.
But like I was saying, that runs the risk of getting pigeonholed in that's all we talk about all the time. And so, being able to put up art reviews or personal stories or reflections. So IndigenousX isn't just Indigenous people talking about Indigenous specific issues. It's just Indigenous people talking about whatever they want to talk about. And so, moving into arts reviews, book reviews, storytelling, poetry. We've published a few poems recently, which is a really cool adaptation, and artworks, political cartoons. So I really want to increase the breadth of what we cover.
Wow.
I think I look at IndigenousX and I think it's a great platform for us to share our stories, and obviously current affairs issues in regards to Aboriginal and Indigenous affairs. But I guess it's also an opportunity as well for non-Indigenous Australia to be able to actually link in and connect and see what's actually going on, firstly from an Indigenous affairs perspective, but then also to almost like walk a day in the life or a week in the life of an Indigenous person as well, and see that we are doing lots of great stuff, lots of awesome stuff, and that we don't fit sort of sometimes these typical molds of what people think that we do. What has been the interaction with non-Indigenous Australia and also the non-Indigenous population globally?
Like we were talking about in the early days with having to really police the space, from trolls. It was also from very well-meaning people who are just so hungry for knowledge that they would often bombard a host with questions that are problematic. What's the Aboriginal word for this? Why do you all do that? Those questions that you can't answer the question as it is. You have to explain what's wrong with the question.
Right.
And that, if hosts were constantly confronted with that, it wouldn't be a space that you would want to give your time to, or very few specific people, predominantly teachers and academics, who would actually be interested in it. So having people, getting the non-Indigenous audience to the point of just sit and listen and bide your time and wait for your moment. So if you have an Aboriginal linguist, ask them about Aboriginal languages.
Totally.
But if you just have someone who's doing whatever else they might be doing, like, ask them questions that are relevant to them as an individual person. We are not that homogenous group. When you say like following for the week and walk a mile in your shoes, it's you really, to get the most out of IndigenousX, you need to follow each week and go, oh, this person's journey is very different from that person and this person, and there are some similarities and commonalities because of course we all have a shared history and key perspectives and sensibilities, but there are people who challenge those and who buck those trends. And so getting that depth of knowledge straight from the individual in a way that if you want to ask a question, we don't owe you anything as a host. So it's like you have to develop a rapport. You have to, show goodwill, and you have to ask questions at the right time, in the right way, of the right person.
Yeah, totally.
And I think, putting that onus of responsibility back on the non-Indigenous audience to say, we really want you to learn because, it's important to share, it's important to learn, and, the more you learn, and again, the less work we have to do a lot of the time. But it's not just, we're not on tap, we're not a jukebox.
Totally.
You don't just get to press the buttons.
It's interesting you say that because we've had interactions with a particular government department here in New South Wales, and their Indigenous unit is very much like, man, we just get the same questions, we're dealing with this across, however many tens or thousands of people who work here, and that's literally like, that's now what they've been bombarded with. But in saying that though, they're taking that as an opportunity to develop resources within the organisation. So on that front, it's good. Cultural awareness and how that all, how that sort of rolls out across the org. But I guess it's really from what you were just saying around, the change in how people need to, I guess, learn how to follow somebody for the week and interact. You're seeing that sort of go on. Over the last 6 years, there must have been some pretty standout either hosts or scenarios that sort of happen. I don't know, like not even just fires that you've had to put out, but there should be some pretty standout sort of moments within IndigenousX history over the last 6 years.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you didn't ask who's your favourite host one.
No, that's a little bit.
It's such a problematic.
It's a bit unfair.
Yeah. But I think really, rather than those individual moments, and there have been some amazing standout moments, but it's just looking at that changing nature of the journey itself. The people who have been there for that whole time, the new people who've come in, how much it's grown. Like I said, when I started it, I'm sure there are a lot more Indigenous people who are on Twitter when I started it, but that were in that tight little circle of us. Maybe 50, maybe 100 at a stretch.
Yeah.
So when I started, it was like, how long are we actually going to be able to do a person a week before we're cycling back through the same people again?
Yeah.
Whereas now there would just be thousands upon thousands of people, and to watch that network have grown and how people interact with each other. And I think social media leads itself, like you apply the tone the other person is speaking in, and so it's very easy to misread or misjudge or take something as innocent when it was actually very snarky or vice versa. But watching how the community has maintained itself and has grown, and inadvertently IndigenousX has just been that sort of beacon on the hill for people who are new, will very quickly gravitate towards IndigenousX.
Right.
And some people just absolutely fall in love with it. Some people don't, and some people move away. But then it's still that point of interaction. It's sort of like it's the meeting place at the start, and so you might just interact with a few people and then move off on your own and keep those interactions going, or you might embrace that whole community and really run with that. But to have created something that, really just for a bit of fun. With no idea what the future held of Twitter or of IndigenousX or of my own journey within that. To have become that, so many people on Twitter don't use the word Indigenous. They use the hashtag IndigenousX when they're talking about Indigenous issues. And so to have become synonymous in a lot of people's vocabulary online with Indigenous issues is, one, a huge responsibility and a huge privilege, but also it's something that we can't really control. And I quite like that about IndigenousX, in that as much as I steer the ship as best as I can, and I make crucial decisions when they need to be made, the life and the growth of IndigenousX really does belong with firstly with the Indigenous community online, then more broadly with the Indigenous community online or offline, because they hear stories about us, they might see our articles, we have that reputation, and then just with the wider global community. And so to have created something where you kind of give it life and let it go is it's very humbling.
Yeah,
definitely.
Tell us about we've been on this journey with you for a few years now, supporting you and seeing you grow and have more reach. You engage with Indigenous and non-Indigenous alike, but you engage now with corporates, with government. Tell us more about, I guess, the influence and the growth of your influence with IndigenousX, over the years as this has started to gain more momentum.
Yeah, well, in the early days, I think, like I said, so much of the stories were based around the negatives of social media. And being fairly outspoken as I was, I think a lot of people sort of perceived IndigenousX. Well, they didn't know how to take. Can be on a given day, but there was a lot of standoffishness, I think, from those bureaucratic spaces and those, traditionally more conservative, politically conservative, but more hesitant to embrace something like IndigenousX, because it had that risk of, we might get a host next week who doesn't like whatever group you represent, and and we're not going to stop that or limit that. But that is true of all media, and I think for some reason, because it was Indigenous social media, people perceived it through a different light until now they recognise, like, if we're here, we've done amazing things And if you're looking to, promote content or promote, the work that you do, or if you're looking to educate the broader community or send messages to specific parts of the community,
Yep.
We're a viable platform, and one of the more viable platforms for engaging with. And so, it was really interesting. Like when I started, I was on leave from teaching with no real intention to go back, because that's often like where you start, and everyone I knew who had a traditional public service background, who knew what I was doing on Twitter, was like, you are burning all of your bridges. This will, you will be bricklaying after this, and I kind of just at the time accepted that as true. And just went, well, these are people who've been doing it for 30, 40 years. They know what it's like, but I believe so much in what I'm doing, and I'm getting so much back from this journey that I just want to see where it goes.
Yep.
And so to see that shift, with bureaucrats, with corporates, with governments who initially were just like, you are dead to us. So now they're like, hey, what are you doing? Can we pick your brains over a coffee? And growing myself personally to that initial point of like, wow, a free coffee. And to now saying like, I think what you want is a consultancy session, and we can talk about that.
Yeah.
So that's been a phenomenal change as well.
That's awesome.
That's an interesting mindset. Like, you were actively being told that you'd be burning your bridges, you could be harming your career, but you obviously could see where this was going. Were you looking globally at what Twitter was doing and what, I guess, the rise of social media, what that was doing? Or was it more just you felt so passionate around being able to tell stories and have people come along and tell their own story? Which all... Was it both? I don't know. Like, what was the sort of feeling there?
No, I think it really was that, I come from, Dad was a bricklayer and a crane driver and bouncer in pubs at different times. Mum worked in a shoe factory after school, and then she ended up becoming a public servant. So she was one of those key people saying, this is not going to end well for you. And I just kind of accepted that as, if that's the price I have to pay to keep doing what I'm doing, then I'm going to do that. It was just so rewarding, and after teaching it was really disheartening. Teaching's one of those jobs, like when you train to be a teacher, you expect to be a teacher. There's no, I've got this degree, I could go and do any one of these 5 million things. It's like, I trained to be a primary teacher. I wanted to be a primary teacher. And then when I left teaching with the personal expectation I wouldn't go back, I was just naturally assuming I would end up like most of my other mates who dropped out in year 10 and went and got labouring jobs, and I was perfectly willing to do that and just tell my stories on Twitter just for fun. I had no expectation that it would ever lead to what it has led to, and I'm very grateful that it has. It really was just, I just fell in love with it, with the interactions, with the community, with the real-time ability to tell stories and crack jokes and build networks and communities. And
was there a point in that time though that you were like, you know what, this could actually eventually become a career path? Or did you just continue on that sort of like, you know what, I'm happy to go lay a few bricks and it's fine, there's no expectation?
There was a desire for it to happen sort of after the first year or two, when we were doing a lot of the work that a lot of groups are very well funded to do. Whether that's building that resources and educational tools and engaging and educating non-Indigenous people, or spaces for connection for Indigenous people. They're spaces that traditionally there's been a lot of resources put behind, but not knowing how those spaces worked, I was kind of like, well, we're doing the work. Someone is going to just come and knock on the door one day and go, we will help you get to that next level. Here's the money to do what you do better, and to actually pay you a wage for doing it. Because especially in those early days, I was there, 12 hours a day at a minimum. Like that was, totally. I was on Twitter. That's where you found me. And that never happened because it doesn't work that way. That's just not how it works. And then, looking at those different models for how that does work, be it grant funding, be it not-for-profit, be it charities, none of those really fit with being able to maintain the core ethical position of the ability to challenge any, status quo truth, any organisation, any entity, didn't really fit those funding models.
Totally.
So it was like, I know we've got something here, but I don't know how anyone would ever fund it or how it would ever become a business.
Yeah.
But again, I was very happy to go, well, we've got this powerful tool and I'll have to make my living elsewhere.
Yeah.
And at the time, single fella, happy to sort of sleep in the swag or crash on couches or
Exactly.
in share houses. I didn't need a lot to live. And at the same time, it was raising my profile. So I was getting more work behind the scenes that had nothing to do with Twitter. So, a lot from schools in the early days. They would get me in to talk about racism in the staff room more than in the playground, or utilising Aboriginal resources, or any of those things. And that was a great way for me to get a bit of recognition with how I'd sort of left teaching feeling a bit burnt out from the space to be embraced back into it. It was really rewarding and kept me afloat financially. So I kind of thought it'll raise my profile personally to go and make money over here, and then IndigenousX. And I think that will always be a natural part of it, because, like I said, it's very hard. Well, in those early days, it was impossible to separate me from IndigenousX.
Very much so.
And again, having Jack come on board and Natalie Crom, who's one of the key writers, and you guys, it's been so great not to have to be IndigenousX all day, every day. Like it's a lot of weight to carry.
Definitely.
It's hard. You get lost within that. And so now that I have that separation, that I can go on IndigenousX, the main source of funding, and thanks to Patreon for rocking up. We've done some early crowdfunding through Start Some Good, who we've had a partnership with and raised a lot of money for other people, and we raised our seed funding that I contacted you guys that helped get us that initial build and help just sustain me while I was building it and growing it and pay for content and legal fees and accountants to help us get that core structure in place. But it's hard to live off one-off crowdfunding. So Patreon, which is a monthly subscription model, because we would never dream of putting up a paywall on the website that said you have to pay for content. That again, just very much against our core principle. But a way for those people who believe in it to contribute, $1 a week, $100, $1 a month, $100, whatever they want to kick in. That is going to be our core business model, and that's risky.
But we're definitely seeing the what do you call it, the benefits of it. And it's not a model that's unfamiliar these days. It's very much a standard sort of, if you're into something and you like it and you want to support it, and there's an opportunity to. It's amazing how many people actually do want to throw some money in different ways into causes that they believe in. So it's good.
Do you get any interaction with the types of people that are donating to IndigenousX, and understand why? Like, what is the feeling? Why people are wanting to donate?
Yeah, well, in the early days, again, because when we started, Patreon had been on for just over a year now. So just before our 5th birthday. And we had probably close to 30,000 followers on Twitter. There was that core group of several hundred people who were just like, we've been waiting for this opportunity.
I can imagine.
Please let us come to the table. So, now that we've got just over 600 Patreons, we're starting to actually think proactively about, like, how do we tap into audiences who aren't that audience? How do we find new people? How do we engage with them? How do we work with them? So we're doing a lot of work behind the scenes at the moment. We're just talking to people and get a feel for what they're interested in, what are the sort of things they feel they can give to, and why, and what do they want. From that, like philanthropy, I've found is a very different space to community funding philanthropy. 1,000 people kicking in $1 versus one person kicking in $1,000 is a very different mindset of what they want and what they're interested in. And so, for us, I think as long as we keep doing good works, people will keep coming. And so I don't want to get too caught up into focus group thinking, because I think the moment you go too far down that path, you sort of dehumanize your audience.
Oh,
You see
definitely.
them as demographics
Yeah.
Yep.
and points, and then you start creating content in response to that. And that's the traditional politician's path, and that's not
Yeah.
the IndigenousX path. So to a degree, there's always got to be, we've got to do what we believe in,
Yep.
and have trust that there will be people out there who understand that and who support that,
Yeah.
and who will contribute
Totally.
to that. But at the same time, like to have more interaction, and you can interact directly on Patreon. We interact obviously through Twitter.
Yeah.
So we've always had a very open process of communication with our audience and with interested parties.
Are you concerned at all that that there's a cap on Indigenous engagement in terms of numbers? It's something that I worry about. Like I look across all the accounts that we sort of social accounts, from Twitter accounts to Instagram and Facebook, and I'm seeing, say for Instagram for instance, I'm seeing the same people across 3 different accounts that have the similar or type of subject matter. So I've started to recognize that Instagram is really great, but we've got a particular audience there, and like particular Indigenous audience, which is very different to the Indigenous audience that's over at Twitter. And I'm really concerned that Instagram's kind of tapped out. I think that we're kind of at a point where we've got to start now looking at how we create content to open to a wider audience and still have the Indigenous subject matter go through it, but not make it entirely about that. So, like, from your perspective, you've got what, 30? How many Twitter followers now?
38 and change.
Yeah, right. It's huge. But then you look at some of the really, really big accounts. You're talking hundreds of thousands of people, and their audiences are spread all across the world. They haven't ever reached a cap because of the wide subject matter. What's your input there? Like, what do you reckon? Is there a cap? Do you have to open up your subject matter?
Yeah, well, I think there's got to be that overlap, because I think if you just have, who is interested in Indigenous, nothing else.
Yeah.
And put that survey across Australia, you'd get back with a specific number.
Yeah.
And that's your number. But there would be a whole bunch of people who wouldn't have said yes to that, who would be if they saw this particular person or topic or focus or philosophy.
Totally.
And so, that's one of the great things about the hosted account.
Yeah.
Is that, we'll have an Indigenous doctor one week, and so all the other doctors on Twitter will go, everyone who works in health, you need to come over and follow this week.
Yeah, so
and then a good chunk of them will stay for the next week.
Yeah.
And go, I didn't realise that this was something I was interested in. And that's, that helps us expand that and grow that. And
it's a great strategy, I have to say. Like, it's a key strategy with social marketing and bringing audiences in, is how do you leverage other key people or just other people's audiences. It's, that's kind of like audience growth 101.
Yeah, I think a lot, in fairness to a lot of the people who say they wouldn't be interested, for a huge chunk of those have zero interaction with actually hearing from Indigenous people, but hear what they're told we believe or we do or we think.
Yeah.
You encounter those people all the time. So, why do you people do this? And it's like, I don't do that. I don't know what you're talking about. Why do you hate free speech or whatever random thing that might be in the media that apparently Aboriginal people don't like? And so, Twitter has been great to not have that editorial. Like, traditionally, we have been subject matter. We have not been the authors of our own story at the national level.
Yeah.
And so now to just say, well, I believe in this, and that might be consistent with some of the things you think, but I also believe this, this, and this.
Yeah.
And then this other person believes something different, and so does this other person, and break down that homogenous view. Because I think, just that whole concept that we live in a country where people could say, I am or I am not interested in Indigenous as a homogenous concept is like, but it's like saying I'm not interested in people. Like, be diverse. Like, who isn't? And I mean, some people probably aren't that interested in people, but that's a very small group who aren't interested in people.
Yeah.
And everyone who is then should be interested in hearing Indigenous stories.
Yeah. Yep.
Battery's flashing.
Okay. All right. What do you want to wrap it up, Liam?
I wouldn't mind just asking about your vision. So,
Yeah, totally.
So tell us, I guess, about your vision for IndigenousX, what the dream is, where you'd like to see it go.
Well, I think the great thing about, like, at the moment we're very heavily positioned as a media entity, a media organisation, citizen journalism, community media, whatever you want to call it. But IndigenousX is that philosophy of amplifying Indigenous stories, telling our stories in our own way, and doing what we can to help. And with an education background and with growing networks of people with other skill sets, there really isn't anything we can't do or be involved in or champion causes or collaborate with. And so, while obviously online media is the beating heart of IndigenousX, we've done workshops, we've worked behind the scenes on campaigns, we're helping other organisations write their own content and look at their own social strategies, but not just social media strategies, like their whole governance,
Totally.
Cultural awareness, professional development, processes, policies and practices. And so, being in a place where we have enough time, enough resources and enough networks when that people who have really important things they're working on come to us and say, we need some help or support or would like to collaborate with. Awesome, let's go. So that vision for me is that at the moment there's a lot of people that we say no to for working with or collaborating or doing because we don't have time, we don't have resources. Is being in a position where whenever we would like to do something, we can, or we can help them find the right people who are in the best position to.
Definitely.
Absolutely. Okay, well, thank you for your story today, Luke. Thank you for coming in and catching up with NGNY. And obviously we've known a lot about that story, but I've certainly learned a lot more today as well from that. So, and I certainly think that our audience will also, will have learned a lot as well from your experiences and your storytelling today.
No, I hope so. Thanks for getting me in, and look forward to the next 6 years, guys.
I know, right?
Thanks, Luke.
Nice one, Luke. Thanks.